Mr. President, I would like to talk about the important legislation that we have pending right now on the Senate floor. I do not see a greater threat to our security interests in this country than a nuclear-armed Iran. And our national security interests require a permanent and verifiable end to Iran's nuclear weapons program. And so today I come to the floor to support the legislation that I was proud to be an original co-sponsor of that will ensure that Congress has review of this agreement if there is an agreement reached with the Iranians, and that we will have a voice on this agreement, because without Congress's involvement in this, I believe that it would be a huge disservice to the American people to not have their elected representatives weigh in on such an important matter. And what matters most is this agreement one that is transparent, verifiable, and will actually end their nuclear program? Because the country of Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. We cannot give one of the most dangerous regimes in the world the most dangerous weapon. Iran has described the United States of America as the Great Satan. Iran has said that it wants to annihilate or wipe out the state of Israel. Iran is a country that is supporting terrorist groups around the world, and we can only imagine the devastation that could be wrought if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. And so the stakes could not be any greater with what is happening right now with the administration negotiating with this regime, one that is not one that we can trust, unfortunately. And so the terms of this agreement matter, and the elected representatives of this country need to have a vigorous debate about this agreement in the Congress, and we need to make sure that it's not an agreement that allows them to continue their march toward a nuclear weapon. Some of the information that's been released so far about the framework that the administration has put together have raised a number of red flags about where this agreement is going. And it is my hope that this legislation passing will ensure that Congress is able to review the agreement to make sure that it is one that ends their nuclear program. But some of the concerns I already see with the framework agreement suggest that the administration is moving in a direction that would not fully force Iran to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure, nor require Iran to address its long history of deception regarding its nuclear program, including long-term questions about the program's military aspects. The framework that has been released would not address Iran's support for terrorism, its intercontinental ballistic missile program, nor its stated desire to wipe Israel off the map. In order to ensure that we have an agreement that would end Iran's nuclear program and hold them accountable, we cannot have a situation where Iran keeps so much of its infrastructure and can then run up to a nuclear weapon or walk to it instead of running to it. Even worse, as we look at the framework of this agreement, and the inspection framework of what the agreement would require, we cannot have an agreement that does not allow unlimited inspections of Iran's nuclear program at any time unannounced, because this is a regime that's not a trustworthy regime. And yet, as I look at the terms of the framework that the administration has announced, it seems like we have a mother may I approach to asking Iran whether we should go in and inspect their facilities. Well, that's going to be unacceptable. We need to ensure that the terms of this agreement, if reached, make sure that we can show up anytime, anywhere, at any time, without notice to Iran, to inspect their facilities, to make sure that they are adhering to the terms of agreement. In short, the framework of this agreement that's been released by the administration suggests that this potential deal could eliminate hard-fought sanctions that we worked together on in this Congress on a bipartisan basis, economic sanctions that brought Iran to the table, which would take years to restore, in return for concessions that have only reversed Iran's program by days or weeks. Iran would retain a massive nuclear infrastructure, and they don't seem to be answering the tough questions about their support for terrorism or their missile program. Iran's activities during these negotiations in supporting terrorism have continued. As their diplomats sit at the negotiating table and smile for the cameras, their government continues to support terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, provide arms and funding to the murderous Assad regime in Syria that has murdered hundreds of thousands of innocent people. It has continued to destabilize Yemen. It has imprisoning innocent Americans and developing an intercontinental ballistic missile whose obvious purpose is to potentially deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States of America. I intend to offer an amendment to the pending legislation that will address Iran's ICBM program, because one of the concerns that I have is that there doesn't seem to be any mention in these negotiations of Iran's development of ICBM capability that could be the delivery mechanism to deliver a nuclear weapon to hit the United States of America. And I will offer that amendment to say to this administration that this issue needs to be on the table, that we need to not only stop their nuclear program, but we need to stop Iran's ICBM program, which some of our intelligence estimates have been that that program could be successful as soon as the end of this year. That's the testimony we've heard in the Armed Services Committee. And so there's real urgency that we stop not only their nuclear program, they're also their support for terrorism and their work on an ICBM that could deliver harm, very grave harm, to our country. In fact, in February, Iran has actually successfully launched a long-range missile system and used a space launch that could be a potential manner in which they would deliver a nuclear weapons capability to our country. And so this is a real concern that we address their missile program in the context of this agreement. In fact, on January 29th of 2014, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified that we judged that Iran would choose a ballistic missile as its preferred method of delivering nuclear weapons capability. And one of the real important issues that we need to debate and address when it comes to their state sponsor of terrorism is what is happening in Yemen right now. As we stand here, we've had a situation where Iran has been harassing and threatening cargo ships in the region, challenging a core American national security and economic interest in the freedom of navigation, particularly in key choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Madab Strait. And if you look at our interest in what has happened in Yemen, Iran has supported the Houthis that have undermined that government in Yemen. Why is that important to us? It's important to us because we had to leave Yemen in part as a result of Iran's support of terrorism in Yemen. And who presides in Yemen? Who is one of the great presences in Yemen? Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a group that has vowed to attack our country, a group that has made attempts to attack us in our country, and Iran is paving the way through their terrorism there to give Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula more space to conduct attacks that can harm our interests and the interests of our allies. So this legislation that's pending on the floor right now, if we were to not pass it, I think people need to understand the implications of it. The implications of not passing this legislation that's on the floor is that Congress would not have any say on these issues that are so important would not have any say on whether the agreement that the administration is negotiating with Iran actually will end their program, actually will dismantle their nuclear program, actually will have a verifiable inspection regime that allows inspectors to go anywhere unannounced at any time to ensure that they are not cheating on whatever agreement is reached between us and the Iranians. So this bill could not be more important. I want to thank the sponsors of this bill. I certainly want to thank Senators Corker and Senators Cardin for their leadership in the Foreign Relations Committee to ensure that the people of this country, through their elected representatives on something of such importance when it comes to the national security of the United States of America, that their elected representatives perform our important oversight role here. And so I am hopeful that we will pass this legislation, that the United States Congress, that I hope the administration, with some of the concerns I've raised about this framework, really toughen what they're doing in this framework to end their program, to have a transparent, verifiable inspection regime, to address the ICBM program, to address Iran's state sponsor of terrorism. I hope that they will do that. But I know that on behalf of my constituents, that it's important, if any agreement is reached, that we have that debate here, that we have a voice in it on behalf of the American people, and that in doing so, we will protect the national security interests of this country to make sure that whatever agreement is entered into is really a good agreement, one that protects our country, which protects our allies, and ends Iran's nuclear program, as none of us can look in the mirror and think about one of the most dangerous regimes in the world having the most destructive weapon in the world. That's something that, as I think about all the national security issues, this is on the top. And so I can't think of a more important debate we could have here now, or more important legislation that we could work on. And with that, I appreciate it, and I would yield the floor.